Oh my goodness, I'm late! Hello everyone and welcome to another video on our own devices. I'm Jean Messier and today we're having a look at yet another piece of industrial timekeeping equipment. This is a Detex Guardsman's clock, also known as a watchman's clock, patrol clock, engineer clock, or tour clock, and these devices were designed to be carried by security guards at factories, railroads, and other facilities to ensure that they were actually walking their patrol route and not sleeping on the job. I first learned about these while researching my previous video on punch clocks, link in the description, and have wanted to cover one ever since, and now I have one to show you. But before we dive into the history and engineering of these fascinating devices, first a word from this video's sponsor, Hungry Minds. Now, if the apocalypse were to go down tomorrow and you were faced with the daunting task of rebuilding civilization from scratch, time recorders would probably not be high on your list of priorities. There'd be many more vital technologies to reestablish first. But which technologies and where would you get the information you needed to get started? Well, in here. The book, aka The Last Book, The Ultimate Guide to Rebuilding Civilization. So I'd actually heard about this book before Hungry Minds contacted me, but I really wasn't prepared for how cool this is. This is an absolutely gorgeous hardbound compendium of all manner of technologies and techniques that underpin a modern functioning society. 400 pages and 23 chapters covering everything from agriculture and cooking to road and bridge building, metal smelting, medicine, weaponry, and even aviation and space travel. And all this is conveyed through absolutely phenomenal drawings, which I can only describe as a combination of engineering drawings and sketches from a Leonardo da Vinci sketchbook. The illustrations are also peppered with fun little visual gags, meaning every time I flip through, I always spot something new. In fact, this really reminds me of Stephen Bistie's Cross Sections book, which I absolutely adored as a child and still do. Better still, all the technical information is correct and very useful, the book having been put together by an international team of artists, engineers, scientists, architects, and designers. Even I learned a thing or two just flipping through it. You can be sure that this is going to inspire quite a few future videos. Now, you know me, I'm very particular about the brands that I will represent on this channel, so it's really quite rare for me to get this excited about a sponsorship deal. And if you want a copy of this book for your own library, just follow the link in the description below or the QR code on the screen right now and enter the promo code OurOwnDevices10 to get 10% off your purchase. So thank you so much to Hungry Minds for sponsoring this video, and back to time recorders. Now, before we get started, I do need to point out a couple of things. First, there were hundreds of different designs of watch clocks produced by dozens of different companies over the past 200 years, and as I've stated before, this is not intended to be a collector's channel, so I can't possibly go over every single model. Rather, I will be focusing on the most important technological developments. Secondly, I have to apologize in advance for the low quality of some of the images in this video. Unfortunately, there aren't a lot of photos available on some of these historic watch clocks, and those that I could find are pretty low resolution, so sorry about that. And finally, I do need to mention the main practical reason that devices like these were created. Yes, companies were worried about paying overtime to guards and watchmen that slept on the job or slacked off, but more importantly, having a physical verifiable record that your guards were actually patrolling your property was essential for securing insurance policies. So these were not just items for controlling your workforce and pinching pennies, at least not entirely. Right, so the first watch clocks were developed at the start of the 19th century, though these early units were not portable like this one, but rather large stationary models mounted throughout the workplace, which the guard had to visit in succession as they patrolled their route. The most common designs were so-called pin clocks, such as those manufactured by British clockmaker Edwin Knight, which featured a clockwork-driven disc with sliding pins projecting radially from the rim at regular intervals, typically every 15 minutes. Every time a guard reached a particular station, they would pull a lever which would depress the pin corresponding to the current time. Now, the clock case was locked so that the guard could not open it and interfere with the mechanism, but the supervisor retained the key so that they could open up the clock and see which pins had been depressed. Finally, there was typically a fixed cam mechanism that would reset all the pins once they had rotated through a full 12 hours. Now, this system worked well enough, but it did have a number of disadvantages. For example, if the guard pulled down the lever for long enough, it would interfere with the next pin and cause the mechanism to jam. But this was solved in later models either by introducing a flexible mechanism that allowed the next pin to just shove it aside, or by mounting the pins perpendicularly to the clock face. Now, due to manufacturing limitations, clocks of any kind were rather expensive in the early 19th century, so having more than a few of these watch clocks in a workplace would have been quite pricey. As a result, by the 1850s, several inventors, including Edward Howard, developed central station systems like the watchman's telltale clock, which used a single clock connected to multiple remote check-in stations via a complex system of cables, pulleys, levers, and bell cranks. Actuating a remote station pulled down one of a series of levers in the central clock that engaged an inclined surface on a perpendicular bar, which forced said bar to slide horizontally and push in the appropriate recording pin on the clock dial. This mechanism was designed so that it could not function unless the remote stations were actuated in the prescribed order. So, for example, the second lever could not extend the sliding bar unless the first lever had already pushed the bar into position, and so on. Finally, actuating the last station disengaged a ratchet and pull mechanism that retracted the bar back to the starting position, resetting the whole system for the next patrol tour. Now, a number of refinements to this basic system were made over the following decades, including separating the recording mechanism from the actual clock movement, which eliminated the previous problem of having to fit the recording mechanism inside the clockwork itself. The original pinwheel arrangement was also eventually replaced with a rotating paper recording disc that was marked using ink pens, carbon paper, or hole-punching mechanisms. Now, as you can imagine, maintaining such a complex system of cables and pulleys could be quite tedious and expensive, which is why by the 1870s you start seeing electrical versions of central station watch clocks using a system of electromagnets, batteries, wires, and switches at each station, which you had to flip to indicate that you had visited it. Now, a recurring theme with this type of technology is the constant arms race between employees trying to figure out how to cheat the system and manufacturers trying to figure out how to stop them from doing that. So early on, guards figured out various ways of shorting out the system so as to register station marks without leaving the central station. And there were a number of ways of getting around this. One was to introduce a spring-driven clockwork mechanism at each station, which the guard had to wind up and release. And this would intermittently open and close an electrical contact in a certain pattern unique to that station, and that would be impressed on the recording disc, and that made it a lot harder to cheat the system. While another was to replace the central battery with crank-driven magnetos mounted at each station, as in a system sold by the Ecomagnetic Clock Company of Boston. Now, large stationary watch clocks continued to be widely used until around the 1910s, when they were largely supplanted by portable watch clocks like this one. The idea being that the guard would carry around the clock, and there would be special keys mounted at stations around their patrol route, and they would have to insert each key in sequence into the clock and record a unique number onto the recording paper. The first portable watchman's clock was patented in 1855 by German inventor Johann Bürk. At the time, Bürk was mayor of Schwenningen in Baden-Württemberg, and his invention was allegedly inspired by his dissatisfaction with the city's night watchman. His basic design was very similar to modern versions, with the first models using a paper tape mounted on the side of a rotating clockwork-driven drum. This tape was printed with multiple rows representing the different stations, while each of the station keys featured a cam mounted in a different position on the shank. When the watchman turned the key in the lock, the cam actuated a punch that pricked a hole in the appropriate row on the tape. Now, the standard model had the capacity for only 6 stations, but Bürk's company also sold models for up to 18 stations. However, this design was expensive to manufacture, so Bürk soon switched to a simpler system using a flat paper recorder chart. For many decades, Bürk's company and products dominated the watch clock market, but eventually dozens of other competitors began to appear. These included Theodor Hahn and Friedrich Imhauser, who replaced the paper punch system with one in which each key directly embossed the number of the station onto the paper disc. The disc was divided into concentric regions, each representing a different station, and the letterpress element on each key was mounted at a different distance from the end of the shank, or each key cut to a different length, so that when it was inserted and twisted, the letterpress would be positioned to emboss the appropriate annular region. These designs were widely copied, appearing, for example, as the Chicago watch clock sold by the Chicago Watchmen's Clockworks from 1911 to 1914. Another variation, invented by one J. Grusen, was the direct push system, in which the letter form was mounted to the end of the key, which was pressed directly into the keyhole to emboss the station number onto the recording disc. Now, a great weakness of this system was that it made it easy for guards to create fake keys, which they could just shove into the hole, which is why production versions included a rotating plate with a number of incised dies matching each of the station numbers, and this could only be rotated to the appropriate die by the matching key, making it impossible to impress the proper station number using a fake key. And this plate could be rotated either left or right, meaning that 9 keys could be used in a total of 18 stations. And this finally brings us to the Detex Guardsman here. So the Detex Corporation started out as the Newman Clock Company, founded in 1878 in Boston by Abraham Newman.
Hello, Newman.
In the 1890s, Newman moved his company to Chicago and began importing portable watch clocks from companies like Bürk. He also received over 30 patents for various improvements to watch clocks, and in 1902 released his own model, the Newman. This introduced a system that embossed rather than punched the station numbers onto the recording disc, and was also among the first American watch clocks to actually include a clock face on the front so the guard carrying it could use it to tell the time. A seemingly trivial improvement that nonetheless helped make the Newman one of the most popular watch clocks in the United States, and the first to be officially approved by insurance rating companies like the Underwriters Laboratory. Now, in 1909, Newman sold his company to businessman Charles Renshaw and immediately formed his own competing firm, the Chicago Watchmen's Clockworks. Unfortunately, this backfired spectacularly as Renshaw set about snapping up all of the competing watch clock companies, and then finally, in 1923, acquired the Chicago Clockworks. He consolidated all of these acquisitions into a firm he named the Detex Watchclock Corporation, the name referring to the ability of watch clocks to detect lazy guards. Initially, Detex retained the product names from its subsidiaries, including the Eco, Alert, Patrol, and Newman. They also introduced a metal grille to protect the clock face and developed a standard system of station keys that could be interchanged between any clock in their product line. Previously, each set of keys was custom fitted to each clock. Now, one of the main weaknesses of early Newman and Detex watch clocks was that the paper recording disc had to be swapped out every 12 hours. Now, in 1912, the representative of a rival German company had approached Newman and suggested that he use a longer paper strip, but he rejected them at the time. However, after the Second World War and the widespread adoption of 2-day weekends and government-mandated holidays and 3-day weekends, Detex changed their mind, and in 1947, they introduced this, the Guardsman clock. So I think that's enough background for now. Let's actually have a closer look at this particular unit, and let me show you how it works. The Guardsman was based on a patent filed by Detex employee August Turing in 1940. This comes in a very robust riveted leather case with a shoulder strap and 2 cutouts on the front. One for the clock face, which reads Detex Corporation, New York, Chicago, Boston, and Atlanta, and Guardsman registered trademark, and one for the station keyhole. There were also originally 2 bolts to secure the case to the clock, as well as a swinging cover over the keyhole, but these are missing from this example. And speaking of the station keys, I have one here, which is chained to a small metal box bolted to the wall at each check-in station. This is a number 2 key, and you can see a raised typeform on the shank, which embosses the station number on the recording tape when the key is inserted and turned in the clock. If we remove the clock from the case, we can see the instructions on the inside, unfortunately largely obscured by decades of gunk. Flipping over the clock's very heavy-duty aluminum case, we find a lock opened by this key, which would be retained by the supervisor so the guard couldn't open and tamper with the clock. Inside the lid, we have more markings: Detex Corporation, made in the USA, serial number G35690, and an Underwriters Laboratory Incorporated certification plate with the number 779597. And as is often the case, I wasn't able to find any reliable serial number lists, but thankfully this label indicates that this particular unit was made in 1975. Inside the unit itself, we have a winding key which fits in 2 sockets, W for winding the clock spring and S for setting the clock hands. This uses an 8-day movement, as evidenced by this label reading Wind this clock Friday, which allows the clock to operate even over long holiday weekends. Early watch clocks tended to use a 12 or 24-hour movement, but Detex sold the 8-day movement as a cost-saving measure since it prevented supervisors from having to come in on long weekends and thus charge overtime. Talk about penny pinching. Now, early Newman and Detex clocks tended to use movements manufactured in Germany by firms like Bürk, but trade interruptions due to the First World War and the Great Depression made these movements harder and harder to come by. Indeed, during the First World War, Detex actually petitioned the British government to let a batch of 500 Bürk clocks through their naval blockade of Germany. And to learn more about an even weirder wartime business deal, please check out this video I wrote over on Today I Found Out. Link in the description. In any case, following the outbreak of the Second World War, Detex switched over to movements manufactured by domestic firms like the Chelsea Clock Company. Next, we press this button to release the tape clamp, then pull the end of the recording tape out of its feed spool and feed it through this curved slot with the sprocket holes at the top. Looking more closely at the tape, we can see that it is divided into 2 sets of 12 hours, one for day and one for night, with each hour being further divided into 15-minute increments. These came in 48-inch lengths, which could record up to 4 days. Getting back to the clock, we next close the tape clamp, then turn this sprocket wheel until the current time on the tape aligns with this tape set arrow. We can also trim the end of the tape by closing this cutter, which is also used to cut off the recorded tape at the end of a guard shift. The clock is now ready to use. And when we close the lid, these jaws clamp these plates on both sides of the tape, creating a rigid platen against which the key can press. As I mentioned before, when the guard reached each station, they inserted the key and turned it, which, as you can see here, embosses the appropriate station number into the tape. Finally, this hook actuates a mechanism that punches a notch in the tape whenever the lid is open and closed, which allows the supervisor to tell if the guard managed to pick the lock and tamper with the tape. And that is how a Detex Guardsman works. Now, by the 1960s, Detex had streamlined its product line to 4 different watch clocks. The Newman, basically unchanged since 1927, the Guardsman, basically unchanged since 1947, the Safety Check stationary watch clock, and the Newman Quartz, which, as the name suggests, used a battery-powered quartz movement and was considerably lighter than its mechanical predecessor. They also diversified into systems for monitoring workplace exits and entrances, and thus in 1963 switched their name to simply the Detex Corporation. Then, in 1981, they moved their factory from Chicago to a new facility in New Braunfels, Texas. Incredibly, Detex continued to manufacture the original Guardsman until 2011, with the design remaining largely unchanged. Today, the company continues to produce guard clock and other time management systems, only now these are more sophisticated computerized devices. And that, dear viewers, is a brief overview of the fascinating technology of guard or watch clocks. I hope you enjoyed that. I certainly enjoyed researching it. Thank you so much for watching, and a huge shout out to Hungry Minds for sponsoring this video. I'll see you in another video where we'll look at yet more clocks and other fascinating devices just like this one. Until then, I'm Jean Messier from Our Own Devices. Have a great day.